The 6th of June 1944 began with waves crashing against the Norman coast in a symphony of impending history. As 22-year-old Private First Class Robert Bob Slaughter of the 29th Infantry Division clutched his M1 Garand rifle inside a Higgins boat, his knuckles white against the cold metal. The boat pitched violently through the dark waters of the English Channel, and the young man from Virginia could hear nothing but the roar of engines, the splash of waves, and the violent retching of his fellow soldiers. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, and Bob Slaughter had no way of knowing whether he would live to see another sunrise. Above the beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the pre-dawn darkness concealed 18,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who had already dropped behind enemy lines hours earlier. Major Richard Winters and the men of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had scattered across the hedgerows of Normandy at approximately 1:30 in the morning, their mission to secure critical causeways and disrupt German communications. Many had landed miles from their designated drop zones, separated from their units, armed only with cricket clickers to identify friend from foe in the terrifying darkness. The planning for this singular day had consumed years of Allied strategic thinking. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had made the agonizing decision just 24 hours prior to launch the invasion, despite marginal weather conditions. His weatherman, Royal Air Force Group Captain James Stagg, had predicted a brief window of improved conditions between storm systems. Eisenhower knew that further delay could postpone the invasion for weeks, potentially allowing the Germans to discover Allied intentions. According to records preserved in the National Archives of the United States, Eisenhower drafted a statement accepting full responsibility for failure, carrying it in his wallet as the invasion commenced, which read, "Our landings have failed and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Across the Channel, German forces remained partially deceived by Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception campaign suggesting that the main invasion would strike at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, had actually returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday on June 6th. So confident was he that weather conditions precluded any invasion attempt. The German 7th Army, commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, held positions along the Norman coast, but critical panzer divisions remained held in reserve, awaiting authorization from Adolf Hitler himself before they could be committed to battle. As Bob Slaughter's landing craft approached Omaha Beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning, naval bombardment from battleships like the USS Texas and USS Arkansas had already begun pounding German defensive positions. Yet the bombardment would prove less effective than hoped. The distance and darkness caused many shells to fall inland, leaving beach obstacles and German bunkers largely intact. Within minutes, Slaughter and thousands of other American soldiers would confront the deadliest beach of the entire invasion, where the German 352nd Infantry Division waited in reinforced positions overlooking the killing zone. The metal ramp of Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel Number 71 dropped at 6:45 that morning, and instantly, machine gun fire from German MG-42 emplacements swept across the opening, cutting down the first men before they could reach the water. Sergeant Thomas Valance, 24th Infantry Regiment, watched in horror as his company commander's head disappeared in a crimson mist before the officer had taken a single step forward. The icy water of the English Channel rose to Valance's chest as he struggled toward the beach, weighted down by 60 pounds of equipment, trying desperately to keep his rifle above the waterline, while men around him sank beneath the waves, pulled under by their gear. Omaha Beach had become a nightmare beyond any training exercise. The preliminary bombing runs by the 8th Air Force had missed their targets entirely due to cloud cover, and many of the specialized D.D. Sherman tanks, designed to swim ashore using flotation screens, had been launched too far from shore and sank immediately. Of the 32 tanks launched from landing craft, only 5 reached the beach. Captain John Robert Slaughter of the 29th Division, no relation to Bob Slaughter, later recalled that the beach was covered with bodies, men with no legs, no arms. God, it was awful. The German defenders held every advantage. Lieutenant Bernhard Ferking of the 716th Infantry Regiment sat protected behind reinforced concrete in Widerstands Nest No. 62, a strong point above the Vierville-sur-Mer draw. His position commanded perfect fields of fire across the tidal flat, and he directed his machine gunners methodically, traversing their weapons across the advancing Americans. The Germans had spent months fortifying this coastline under Rommel's direction, installing Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and millions of mines. Rommel had proclaimed that the invasion must be defeated at the water's edge, or not at all, and his preparations seemed vindicated as American soldiers huddled behind beach obstacles, pinned down by withering fire. Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Infantry Division moved along the beach under fire, rallying terrified men with acts of conspicuous bravery. Historical accounts from the U.S. Army Center of Military History document his famous exhortation, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." His leadership proved critical in breaking the paralysis that had gripped many units. Rangers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, who had landed in the initial assault waves, began scaling the cliffs using ropes and ladders, attacking German positions from unexpected angles. By 9:30 in the morning, the situation remained so desperate that Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army from the USS Augusta offshore, seriously considered evacuating Omaha Beach entirely and diverting follow-up waves to Utah or the British sectors. Communications had broken down almost completely. The beach was clogged with destroyed vehicles, wounded men, and the bodies of the dead. Medics like Thomas "Doc" Bowers worked frantically in the surf, treating sucking chest wounds and tourniqueting shattered limbs while exposed to constant fire. Yet gradually, through countless individual acts of courage, small groups began penetrating the German defenses. Bangalore torpedoes blasted gaps through wire obstacles. Engineers cleared mine paths despite devastating casualties. Destroyers like the USS McCook moved dangerously close to shore, risking grounding to provide direct fire support against bunkers. The tide of battle shifted not through grand strategy, but through the accumulated bravery of young men who advanced because staying meant certain death. While drama unfolded on Omaha Beach, 12 miles inland near the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division fought their own desperate battles in the Norman darkness. Private John Steele of F Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had the misfortune of landing directly on the church steeple of Sainte-Mère-Église at approximately 2:30 that morning, his parachute snagging on the bell tower, while German soldiers shot his fellow paratroopers as they descended. Steele hung there for 2 hours playing dead, while the battle raged below him and the church bell rang beside his head. The airborne assault had been plagued by problems from its inception. German anti-aircraft fire had scattered the C-47 transport aircraft formations, causing pilots to take evasive action and lose their orientation in the darkness and clouds. Instead of concentrated drops onto designated zones, paratroopers found themselves scattered across hundreds of square miles of Norman countryside. Many landed in the flooded marshlands behind Utah Beach, which the Germans had deliberately inundated as a defensive measure. Weighed down by equipment, dozens drowned in 4 feet of water, unable to release their parachute harnesses in the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krause led elements of the 3rd Battalion, 505th Regiment into Sainte-Mère-Église around 4:30 in the morning after hours of gathering scattered paratroopers. The town became the first French settlement liberated by Allied forces when Krause raised an American flag in the town square, fulfilling a promise he had made before departure. However, German forces would counterattack throughout the day, making the American hold on the town precarious. Major Richard Winters exemplified the initiative required of airborne officers on D-Day. Landing far from his designated drop zone, Winters assembled a mixed group of 82nd and 101st Airborne troopers and moved toward his objective, a battery of German artillery at Brecourt Manor that was firing on Utah Beach. though accounts vary, as researched and documented in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers and subsequent U.S. Army analysis. Winters led an assault on 4 German 105mm howitzers with approximately 15 men against a German force of 50. Using fire and maneuver tactics, they destroyed the guns and killed or captured the German crews, an action for which Winters received the Distinguished Service Cross. The hedgerow country of Normandy, called bocage by the French, created a nightmarish tactical environment. These ancient earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation, formed natural fortifications, turning every field into a potential killing zone and making it nearly impossible to maintain unit cohesion or establish organized defensive lines. Paratroopers found themselves fighting in small, isolated groups, often commanded by lieutenants or sergeants leading men they had never met before. Colonel Robert Sink's 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had the mission of securing the western exits from Utah Beach by capturing the causeways across the flooded areas. Without these causeways, the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah Beach would be trapped on a narrow strip of sand, vulnerable to counterattack. Throughout the early morning hours of June 6th, small groups of paratroopers fought vicious close-quarters battles for control of these critical access routes, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. 20 miles east of Omaha Beach, British and Canadian forces conducted their own amphibious assaults under somewhat more favorable circumstances, though the fighting remained intense and costly. At Sword Beach, the easternmost of the 5 invasion beaches, Brigadier the Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade landed at approximately 8:20 that morning, preceded by commandos who waded ashore to the sound of bagpipes played by piper Bill Millen. Lovett had ordered Millen to play despite regulations prohibiting pipers in combat, believing it would raise morale, and the young piper marched up and down the beach playing Highland Laddie and The Road to the Isles, while German bullets kicked up sand around him. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, elements of the 21st Panzer Division, positioned south of Caen, finally received authorization to counterattack. German Panzer IV and Panther tanks rolled north toward the invasion beaches, supported by Panzer Grenadiers and half-tracks. They exploited a gap between Sword and Juno beaches, reaching positions within sight of the English Channel by 7 in the evening. For a brief moment, the possibility existed that German armor might split the British beachhead and roll up the Allied positions. However, the Luftwaffe's near-total absence from the battlefield meant German commanders lacked accurate intelligence about Allied dispositions and strength. As the 21st Panzer Division advanced, their commanders observed a massive aerial armada passing overhead, gliders carrying reinforcements to the British 6th Airborne Division east of the Orne River. Fearing they were advancing into a trap and lacking infantry support or clear orders, the German commander withdrew his tanks after dark, abandoning the only realistic chance of throwing the invaders back into the sea. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Rod Keller faced some of the fiercest resistance outside of Omaha. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifle Regiment landed at 7:55 that morning against well-prepared German positions. Rough seas delayed their landing craft, causing them to touch down during a rising tide when beach obstacles were partially submerged and more dangerous. The Canadians suffered approximately 340 casualties in the initial assault waves, but pushed inland with determination, advancing farther than any other Allied unit on D-Day. Private Leo Gariepi of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, who had dropped with the British 6th Airborne east of the Orne River, fought to hold critical bridges that would prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Historical documentation from the Canadian War Museum indicates that Canadian forces captured the strategically important Carpiquet airfield outside Caen, though they would not hold it against German counterattacks. By nightfall, the Canadians had penetrated 6 miles inland, linking up with British forces from Gold Beach to create a continuous beachhead. Gold Beach, assaulted by the British 50th Infantry Division, saw relatively lighter casualties compared to Omaha, though the fighting remained intense. The Green Howards Regiment overcame fortified positions at La Rivière, while commandos of 47 Royal Marine Commando fought house-to-house battles through the seaside town of Port-en-Bessin, which controlled a crucial road junction. At Utah Beach, the westernmost landing zone, A navigation error proved fortuitous when Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., assistant commander of the 4th Infantry Division and eldest son of President Theodore Roosevelt, waded ashore at 6:30 that morning to discover his entire assault wave had landed nearly a mile south of the intended beach. At 56 years old, Roosevelt was the oldest man in the initial assault and the only general officer to land with the first wave. Suffering from arthritis and heart disease, he had personally requested assignment to the invasion, telling his superiors, "The troops will have more confidence in a man who has been with them." Roosevelt quickly reconnoitered the area, determined that the mistaken landing site actually offered better routes inland than the planned beaches, and made a decision that would be studied in military academies for generations. According to the official U.S. Army historical record preserved at Fort Leavenworth's Combined Arms Research Library, Roosevelt declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His decision to improvise rather than attempt to shift the landing to the correct beach saved countless lives and allowed the 4th Infantry Division to move inland quickly, with relatively light casualties of approximately 200 men, the lowest of any beach on D-Day. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment conducted what many historians consider one of the most remarkable individual actions of D-Day. Landing near the village of Mazedon, Summers single-handedly assaulted and cleared 15 buildings held by German forces, killing or capturing over 50 enemy soldiers throughout the day, while leading a constantly shifting group of paratroopers. The German response to the Utah landings remained confused and disorganized. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, had been celebrating his birthday when reports of paratroop landings began arriving. He immediately recognized this as the invasion and ordered his reserves forward. But the Luftwaffe's absence meant German commanders had no clear picture of the invasion's scale or main thrust. Meanwhile, German 7th Army headquarters continued to believe that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion, and that the main invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais. This misperception, carefully cultivated by Allied deception operations, would persist for weeks and prevent the Germans from committing their full strength against the Normandy beachhead. The German 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais with 19 divisions, remained in position, awaiting an invasion that would never come. In his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, spent the early hours of June 6th trying to determine whether the reports flooding in represented the actual invasion or another diversion. At 68 years old, von Rundstedt had served in both world wars and possessed a strategic mind honed by decades of military service. But he found himself constrained by Hitler's micromanagement and the Byzantine command structure the Führer had imposed on the Western defenses. The German command structure in France represented one of Hitler's greatest strategic blunders. Von Rundstedt theoretically commanded all forces in the West, but Field Marshal Rommel, as commander of Army Group B, reported directly to Hitler on many matters. The panzer divisions, crucial for any successful counterattack, could not be moved without Hitler's personal authorization. On the morning of June 6th, Hitler was sleeping at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in Bavaria, and his staff refused to wake him. Hours passed while German commanders pleaded for permission to commit the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division against the invasion beaches. Major Werner Pluskat, commanding an artillery battalion overlooking Omaha Beach, had spent the pre-dawn hours in his bunker when his field telephone rang at approximately 5:45 in the morning. His regimental commander asked if anything unusual was happening. Pluskat stepped outside and turned his artillery binoculars toward the channel. What he saw made his blood freeze, thousands of ships covering the water from horizon to horizon. When he called back to report, his commander initially refused to believe him, but Pluskat insisted, "It's the invasion. There must be 10,000 ships out there." Lieutenant Arthur Johnke commanded Strongpoint W5 at Utah Beach, positioned directly where the Americans would land. Johnke had spent months preparing his position, laying mines, constructing bunkers, and positioning his weapons for interlocking fields of fire. He commanded approximately 80 men, many of them Russian and Polish volunteers, who had been captured on the Eastern Front and given the choice between service in the German army or starvation in POW camps. When the naval bombardment began, it destroyed his communications and killed or wounded many of his men before the first American soldier set foot on the beach. Oberleutnant Bernhard Furking, whose machine guns had cut down so many Americans at Omaha Beach, fought from his bunker throughout the morning, burning through belt after belt of ammunition. He could see that the Americans had taken devastating casualties, yet they kept coming. By midday, with his ammunition running low and American troops infiltrating around his position, Furking faced the choice between death and surrender. Many German soldiers at Normandy would face this same bitter decision in the hours and days ahead. The absence of the Luftwaffe proved devastating for German defenders, who found themselves under constant air attack without any friendly air cover. Lieutenant Gustav Keil, a Focke-Wulf 190 pilot based near Paris, received orders to attack the invasion fleet at first light. His entire Staffel squadron of 12 aircraft took off at dawn. They encountered a sky filled with Allied fighters. Only 4 German aircraft returned from that mission, having accomplished nothing. The Luftwaffe flew only 319 sorties on D-Day, compared to the Allies' 14,440, a ratio that made German tactical movement nearly impossible during daylight hours. Grenadier Heinrich Severloh, serving in Widerstands Nest No. 62 above Omaha Beach, would later claim to have fired over 12,000 rounds from his MG-42 machine gun on June 6, earning him the nickname, the Beast of Omaha, in post-war accounts. Whether his personal tally was accurate or exaggerated, there is no question that German defenders like Severloh inflicted horrific casualties on the Americans at Omaha Beach before finally being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. By noon on the 6th of June, the outcome of D-Day, though not yet certain, had begun tilting decisively in the Allies' favor, despite the desperate situation still prevailing at Omaha Beach. At Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches, Allied forces had established beachheads extending 1 to 6 miles inland, and were consolidating their positions against German counterattacks. Supplies flowed ashore in increasing quantities as engineers cleared beach obstacles and expanded the landing areas. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion had accomplished one of the day's most celebrated feats at Point du Hoc, a 100-foot-high cliff between Utah and Omaha Beaches, where German artillery batteries supposedly threatened both landing areas. Rudder's 225 Rangers scaled the cliffs under fire, using rocket-propelled grappling hooks and extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. Reaching the top after brutal fighting, they discovered the German guns had been moved inland, replaced by telephone poles as decoys. Undeterred, Ranger patrols found the actual guns hidden in an apple orchard a half-mile inland and destroyed them with thermite grenades. The Rangers then held their position for 2 days against German counterattacks, losing more than half their strength. At Omaha Beach, the situation that had seemed hopeless at mid-morning gradually improved as individual initiative and accumulated firepower began overwhelming German defenses. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, rallied his men with words that became legendary. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." By 1 in the afternoon, American troops had begun breaking through the defensive belts, capturing the bluffs that commanded the beach. Navy destroyers continued playing a crucial role, moving so close to shore that they risked grounding. The USS Frankfurt came within 800 yards of the beach to engage a German strong point directly, while the USS McCook's captain famously announced, "We're going in to give them hell." These destroyers provided the direct fire support that the preliminary bombardment had failed to deliver, systematically destroying bunkers and gun positions. The village of Colleville-sur-Mer, which overlooked Omaha Beach, changed hands 3 times during the afternoon, as American troops pushed inland and German reserves counterattacked. House-to-house fighting consumed the town, with Americans using grenades to clear buildings while German snipers exacted a steady toll. By evening, the Americans held Colville, but at tremendous cost. Weather continued influencing operations throughout the day. The storms that meteorologist Group Captain Stagg had predicted would follow the brief window of improvement began arriving by late afternoon, making subsequent waves of landing craft even more difficult and dangerous. Ships pitched violently, men became seasick, and some landing craft swamped in the heavy seas. The marginal weather conditions that Eisenhower had gambled on were deteriorating, validating his decision to launch the invasion when he did, rather than waiting for perfect conditions that might never come. By nightfall on June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, though this fell short of optimistic planning figures. The beachheads remained vulnerable, particularly the gap between Omaha Beach and the British-Canadian sectors, and none of the major D-Day objectives, including Caen, Bayeux, or Carentan, had been captured. However, Allied forces had breached the Atlantic Wall, established themselves on French soil, and survived the critical first day when they were most vulnerable to being pushed back into the sea. As darkness fell over Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, medics throughout the beachhead worked by lamplight to save the wounded while graves registration teams began the grim task of collecting and identifying the dead. The human cost of D-Day would ultimately total approximately 10,000 Allied casualties, including 4,414 confirmed dead, a number that included 2,500 Americans, with the heaviest losses occurring at Omaha Beach. At the 16th Field Hospital, established just inland from Omaha Beach by late afternoon, surgeons worked in converted barns and tents, performing operations under the most primitive conditions. Dr. Harold Baumgarten, who had come ashore with the first assault wave as an infantry medic, treated sucking chest wounds, compound fractures, and traumatic amputations throughout the day. The wounded kept arriving in an endless stream, carried by litter bearers who traversed minefields and came under sporadic German artillery fire. The German casualties on D-Day remain more difficult to quantify due to incomplete records, but estimates suggest approximately 4,000 to 9,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on June 6th. For many German defenders, particularly the Ost battalions composed of impressed Soviet prisoners, capture came as a relief rather than a defeat. These men, who had been given the choice between starvation and service in the Wehrmacht, surrendered readily when the opportunity arose. French civilian casualties from the D-Day operations and associated aerial bombardment numbered approximately 3,000, a tragic but often overlooked cost of liberation. The town of Sainte-Mère-Église suffered significant damage from the airborne assault, and many Norman villages near the beaches were destroyed by naval gunfire and subsequent fighting. For French civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation, June 6th brought both hope and horror, liberation and loss. Young Simone Renaud, daughter of Sainte-Mère-Églis's mayor, would later recall watching American paratroopers descend through the night sky while the church burned from German incendiary bombs. Her father, Alexandre Renaud, risked his life to assist wounded American paratroopers, hiding them from German patrols. The Renaud family, like countless French families throughout Normandy, chose to help the liberators despite knowing the Germans would execute them if discovered. Across the English Channel in Britain, families waited anxiously for news of the invasion whose occurrence was announced, but whose details remained censored for security reasons. King George VI led the nation in prayer, while Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had desperately wanted to observe the landings from a Royal Navy cruiser, until talked out of it by the king himself, monitored reports in the War Cabinet rooms beneath Whitehall. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio that evening, leading Americans in prayer for "our sons, pride of our nation," who had launched the Great Crusade. His prayer, broadcast across America, asked for divine help to strengthen Allied arms and for the spiritual fortitude to endure the trials ahead, acknowledging that some will never return, but that their sacrifice served to set free a suffering humanity. The men who survived D-Day would carry its memories for the rest of their lives. Decades later, veterans would still wake from nightmares of drowning men, burning tanks, and the screams of wounded comrades. Many, like Private Robert Sales of the 116th Infantry Regiment, who watched his entire 30-man boat section die within minutes of landing at Omaha Beach, struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others perished. The dawn of the 7th of June brought no respite for the exhausted soldiers who had survived D-Day. If anything, the fighting intensified as German forces, having finally grasped the scale and location of the invasion, rushed reinforcements toward Normandy, while Allied commanders raced to expand and consolidate the beachheads before German armored divisions could organize a coordinated counterattack. American forces faced the critical task of linking the Omaha and Utah beachheads, which remained separated by approximately 10 miles on the morning of June 7th. The town of Carentan, situated on a key road junction between the two beaches, became the objective for the 101st Airborne Division. For 5 days, paratroopers fought through flooded fields and hedgerows to capture the town in brutal close-quarters combat. The British drive on Caen, intended to be captured on D-Day, bogged down in the face of German resistance stiffened by the arrival of panzer divisions. The city, which Montgomery had confidently predicted would fall within hours, would not be fully captured until mid-July, becoming one of the most controversial aspects of the Normandy campaign. The grinding battle for Caen would destroy 90% of the medieval city and kill thousands of French civilians trapped in the fighting. The hedgerow country of the Bocage turned Normandy into a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. Each field, bordered by ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation and trees, required a separate assault. German defenders could position machine guns and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons in hedgerows, inflict casualties on advancing Americans, then retreat to the next hedgerow 50 meters back and repeat the process. Advances were measured in fields per day rather than miles. Tank crews faced particular horrors in the Bocage. The hedgerows were impenetrable to most tanks, forcing them to use gaps and gates that German defenders covered with anti-tank weapons. Many Sherman tanks fell victim to German 88mm guns and Panzerfaust rockets. American tankers grimly joked that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 German Panther tank, 4 to distract it, while the 5th shot it from behind. The Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit earned it the nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter advertised as lighting first time every time. Innovative American soldiers began developing solutions to the hedgerow problem. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron designed steel teeth, fabricated from German beach obstacles, that could be welded to tank fronts, allowing them to punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This rhinoceros, or Cullen hedgerow device, spread rapidly through American armored units, dramatically improving their tactical mobility. By the end of June 1944, the Allies had landed approximately 850,000 troops in Normandy, along with approximately 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. However, they had also suffered approximately 62,000 casualties and remained confined to a beachhead far smaller than pre-invasion planning had projected. The ancient Norman city of Caen still held out against British assault, while American forces remained entangled in the Bocage. The invasion launched on the 6th of June 1944 would ultimately require 11 months of brutal fighting before Germany's final surrender on the 8th of May, 1945. The road from Normandy to Berlin claimed millions of lives, destroyed countless cities, and tested the Allied coalition to its breaking point. Yet D-Day represented the decisive turning point that made that ultimate victory inevitable. The statistical dimensions of Operation Overlord stagger the imagination. The invasion required approximately 5,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops for the initial assault. The preceding months had seen 2 million American soldiers transported across the Atlantic to Britain, the largest military deployment in history. The invasion fleet stretched across 96 kilometers of English Channel, while the airborne assault deployed 24,000 paratroopers and glider troops behind enemy lines. The logistical achievement equaled the Marshall accomplishment. Within weeks of D-Day, Allied engineers had constructed 2 artificial harbors called mulberries off the Norman coast, creating instant port facilities that allowed supplies to flow directly from ships to the beaches. When a massive storm on the 19th of June destroyed the American mulberry at Omaha Beach, the British mulberry at Arromanches kept operating, eventually landing 2.5 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who had improvised brilliantly at Utah Beach despite his age and health issues, would receive the Medal of Honor for his D-Day actions. Though the award came posthumously, Roosevelt died of a heart attack in Normandy on the 12th of July, 1944, just over a month after the invasion. He was buried in the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer overlooking Omaha Beach, where he rests among the 9,388 American military dead from the Normandy campaign. The Normandy American Cemetery, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, stands today as a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. The white crosses and stars of David stretch in perfect rows across the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, each representing a young life given for freedom. French schoolchildren place flowers on the graves each year on the anniversary of D-Day, a tradition continuing into the 21st century, ensuring that the liberators are not forgotten by those they freed. The Allied victory in Normandy came at tremendous cost. Approximately 209,000 Allied casualties between June and August 1944, including 37,000 dead. German casualties in the same period totaled approximately 450,000, including 240,000 killed or wounded. The French civilian death toll in Normandy reached approximately 20,000. Their homes and communities transformed into battlefields. Yet the cost of not launching the invasion, of allowing Nazi tyranny to continue unchallenged, would have been infinitely higher. D-Day represented the physical manifestation of the Allied commitment to defeating fascism regardless of sacrifice. The young men who waded through the bloody surf at Omaha, who parachuted into darkness over Normandy, who sailed through artillery fire onto Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah beaches, gave everything to restore freedom to enslaved Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting on D-Day years later, wrote, "Every man in that mighty host had faith that right would prevail, that freedom would endure, that civilization would not perish from the earth." That faith, combined with extraordinary courage and unprecedented logistical achievement, transformed the 6th of June, 1944 from an ordinary day into a turning point in human history. D-Day demonstrated that free peoples, united in common cause and willing to sacrifice for their ideals, could overcome tyranny regardless of how powerful it appeared. The men of D-Day saved the world, and humanity owes them a debt that can never be fully repaid. Their legacy lives on not merely in the freedom they won, but in the example they set, that there are causes worth fighting for, evils that must be opposed, and moments when ordinary individuals must become heroes. As the last veterans of D-Day pass into history, their story must be preserved and retold, ensuring that future generations understand the price that was paid for the freedom they enjoy. The 6th of June, 1944 stands forever as a monument to human courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who answered freedom's call.